Hello viewers and welcome to our channel. Today, we're delving into the annals of history to uncover the 10 most financially burdensome and impactful conflicts the world has ever witnessed. Wars aren't just clashes of arms, they are costly endeavors that have shaped civilizations and economies. So stick around as we journey through the costly sagas that shaped our world. Number 1. Cold War. The Second World War technically stands as the most expensive war, but the Cold War, though unconventional with no major invasions, remains a costly conflict. Lasting from 1940 to 1996, the nuclear arms race, central to the Cold War, led to America spending a staggering $5.8 trillion. Though Soviet expenditures are harder to confirm, it's likely they invested substantially. In total, it's a safe estimate that over $10 trillion worldwide was dedicated to the Cold War and the continual upkeep of nuclear arsenals, positioning it as the unequivocal leader in the most expensive war saga, despite its unconventional nature. Number 2. World War II. The Second World War's expense surpasses all, estimated at $4.7 trillion when adjusted for inflation. In the war's final year, the U.S. spent 40% of its total GDP, a figure far higher than modern wars, cracking the trillion-dollar mark. World War II's vast scale saw 12.2 million troops deployed, compared to today's 2.5 million in the military. The allocated funds covered significant resources: 41 billion rounds of ammunition, 303,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and 27 aircraft carriers, among others. Tax rates soared to 94% to cover costs. For context, privates earned $50 a month. Number 3. World War I. The First World War might not have been as costly as World War II, but it severely strained global finances. Estimated at $185 billion to $208 billion in wartime dollars, even at the lower end, adjusted for 1918 inflation, it equates to a staggering $3.3 trillion today. Germany incurred the highest cost, totaling over $37 billion in wartime currency, roughly $686 billion in today's value. The U.S. invested $414 billion, and the British spent $641 billion. Financially, it was no victory for anyone. Germany's hyperinflation reached absurd levels. A loaf of bread cost $428 billion German marks, with the currency plummeting in value. Number 4. War of 1812. The War of 1812, an early American conflict, proved financially burdensome. By its end, the government's debt reached $158 million, with over $90 million allocated to the Army and Navy. Adjusted for inflation, this amounts to around $2.8 trillion invested in the war. Facing bankruptcy by 1814, the government struggled to maintain expenses, resulting in soldiers' pay arrears. To compensate, soldiers were offered land, up to 320 acres, for their service despite delayed payments. Private individuals like David Parrish, Stephen Girard, and John Jacob Astor collectively contributed nearly $16 million to alleviate the debt. Number 5. War in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan, seemingly perpetual, lasted over 2 decades. While it may be tentatively over, the region's instability prevents a clear mission accomplished declaration. The estimated cost stands at around $2.3 trillion, averaging about $300 million daily over years. Breakdowns of expenses are intricate. Approximately $800 billion went directly to costs like soldier salaries and equipment, while $85 billion funded Afghan army training. Despite this, the Taliban swiftly overtook the Afghan army. An additional $750 million was allocated to Afghan army salaries. Other expenditures covered support for injured veterans and incurred interest from the initial spending. Number 6. Iraq War. The U.S. was involved in Iraq from 2003 to 2011, with troops remaining since. The overall cost reached $1.9 trillion, covering various expenses, primarily for soldiers and equipment. However, a substantial portion of this amount was misused. Misappropriation of funds occurred in both Iraq and Afghanistan, with an estimated 1/3 of the money designated for contracts being lost to fraudulent claims. This resulted in contractors overbilling the government for their gain. Between both countries, this equated to $31 billion to $60 billion of the $138 billion allocated to contractors, whether legitimate or not. Number 7. Vietnam. The U.S. involvement in Vietnam began in 1965 and continued until 1973, despite the war starting in 1959. Throughout those 8 years, more than $168 billion was spent, which included $28.5 billion in aid for southern Vietnam. Adjusted for inflation, the total expense surpassed $1 trillion, reaching around $1.25 trillion by 1969. Remarkably, the financial impact of the Vietnam War remains ongoing. Veterans and their families receive annual compensation amounting to $22 billion, totaling roughly $270 billion since 1970. Veterans and their spouses were entitled to benefits, and children received support until adulthood. Number 8. Korean War. It may have been the source of comedy in the form of the book, movie, and TV show Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, but the price tag of the Korean War was no joke. When it ended in 1953, the total cost was tallied at around $30 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that works out to over $308 billion. It also cost 3 years and 36,000 American lives, as well as over 1 million South Korean civilians and 200,000 North Korean civilians. Number 9. American Civil War. The U.S. entered the Civil War in 1861 with a $64.8 million debt, which soared to $5.2 billion by its end. Adjusted for inflation, this amounted to about $87 billion. To fund the war, the government introduced the Legal Tender Act in 1862, issuing $500 million in bonds and creating non-gold-backed paper currency, or greenbacks, serving as government IOUs. Varied estimates pegged the war's total cost around $7 billion, covering general war expenses and human losses. Putting a price on human life remains debated, with northern expenses averaging around $139 per person, equivalent to a year's GDP per capita, while southern costs were approximately 3 times higher. Number 10. Second Sino-Japanese War. The Second Sino-Japanese War, lasting from 1937 to 1945, ranks among the costly wars in history. Despite its significance in World War II, it's often overlooked in Western history due to its indirect association with the Allied forces. Japan's monthly spending peaked at a staggering $7,713,150,000 yen, equivalent to $413 million to $1.3 billion today. Over 8 years, Japan's expenses for the war are estimated between $39 billion to potentially over $100 billion. If you found this exploration of the most expensive wars in history fascinating, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Join our community to uncover more enthralling stories from the past that continue to shape our world today.